Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Human Rights Day is observed every year on December 10th, and this year's theme relates to equality, inclusion, and non discrimination. Now, as we approach the end of the year, it's also a good time to take stock of how Malaysia has fared in reducing inequalities and upholding human rights. Gerald Joseph is one of the commissioners of the National Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, or better known as Suhakam. He joins us now. Gerald, we want to take a look at what's happened in the past year and some of the headlines, particularly relating to the issues about human rights. And I'm just wondering what you thought were some of the biggest issues of the year and some of the headlines that most exemplified human rights issues this year.
Hi, good evening, Melissa and Sharad. Well, I think the list continues to be rather long, but also there's a list that is unclear because of the political turmoil, uncertainty at the top. I think that probably should color the moving forward or non-movement of human rights for 2021. I think governments with political leadership in position of powers are actually the duty bearers for human rights. So, of course, we go to ministries, ministers, departments to get them to get it right. But if the top is uncertain of the position and stability, which we have seen governments change so fast, then we've also felt some of the issues have not moved forward, like the reform of bills. There's a whole host of good reforms initiated from 2018 to 19, and it's the same members of parliament there, and some of them actually voted in favor. But some of these have gone silent. The Reform of Sedition Act, Poka Pota. So we hear bits and pieces, and Suhakam has given its input, but hoping for a more systematic approach to reform these bills. It's not really happening yet, and so now the new government is in, and so again we are hoping and waiting for that kind of institutional engagement to move that forward.
Gerald, Gerald, I can ask you, to kind of pin it down a little. I mean, for a lot of people who perhaps are not so well versed with what would constitute a human rights issue, whether it's civil, political, social, economic in nature, what headlines, like say, for example, the death camps of Wang Kalian, it's kind of it's really shouted out to the Malaysian public, this is a human rights violation. What happened this year that you think had that kind of impact in terms of the public's understanding of human rights?
Yeah, I think, something shout out to you, but if you just go through the list on freedom of expression, there were a few rallies by Lawan and others. The respect of the Freedom of Assembly Act happened during the event, but post the event, there was still called up for investigation or round 2, round 3. And I think that should not have happened. So we have question marks on freedom of expression. But what colored it was the emergency ordinance that was in power, and that impacted some of the rights application, including the fake news emergency bill. So a lot of this emergency sort of rendered the need for expression. Online, you get called up. But that did not stop cases of some death in custodies that have come up to the news. That still happens, and very worrying. Why is it happening?
Okay. All right. If I just may follow up on kind of Sharad's point there, and I just wonder because again, the death camps in Wang Kalian, that's a recognizably human rights violation. Gender equality, the judgment case about mothers not being able to confer citizenship on their children born in Malaysia or born outside of Malaysia. So those are the things I think also made headlines this year. But I'm just wondering about other maybe economic dimensions or dimensions of, say, children not being able to go to school, not being able, people not being able to go to work. Is that considered an infringement of human rights?
Yeah, obviously, and I was just getting to that on the MCO, the lockdowns, the impact on the economic mobility and economic strength of people. So there was this white flag campaign, a white flag movement, and so food became an issue. Joblessness or job security became an issue for Malaysians as well as for foreign workers. They easily lose their contracts and then rendered illegal. So that became how to manage foreign labor in the country. In the midst of pandemic, some industries continued, like the plantation, the manufacturing, and then we've also got so many reports on forced labor practices. I mean, coming out from another country, sort of banning some products or demanding some change. So I think that also took center stage, this issue of forced labor. Then I think for the first time, Malaysians recognize the seriousness of mental health stress issues on people. We saw the suicides increase at a period. Never before have we discussed this openly and directly. And I think sadly we've lost people to suicide, but I think for the first time it has come up for interest in Malaysia. But I think also we realized that one area that keeps growing is the notion of an equal Malaysian citizenship and equality framework. So we get conversations that Malaysia is moving in the right direction, and then you get a reaffirmation that the separation of budgets for majority, minority, Bumiputera, non-Bumiputera. So I think this I think brings to fore the issue of racism, racial discrimination that is still very much part of the political landscape and the governance mechanism. I think after almost 70 years of a country independent, this can and should never be our base framework for governance.
Gerald, I want to ask if in the minds of the public, it's clear whether something like, the government basically criminalizing a lot of daily life, right? Not being able to go to the park. I mean, we have people fined for visiting a cemetery to go and see, to visit the grave of a loved one, and some very interesting moments during the MCO over the last year or so, where the idea that public health concerns trump your right to work, trump your right to privacy in the form of My Sejahtera and apps and those kinds of surveillance tools. Where is the balance in that? And what are your personal views about what we can or must give up or not give up in a crisis?
Well, I think what we should not give up is our fundamental freedoms and basic dignity and rights. How that's managed in the most severe of crises, like a pandemic, I think is what we learned the hard way, to find the balance between both. As you say that because of the pandemic, your rights curtailed, you get fined, and there's a question of is it antara dua darjat? Some get fined small, some get fined big. How come some get away? So I think one is the consistency of the management of a public health crisis, but that should not disable a person from other rights that still are inherent, the right to health. So if you have to walk to the park, find a way to enable it to happen. So I think Suhakam also started receiving quite many complaints the last 2 months about those not vaccinated, also getting trouble in terms of accessibility to rights. So we say, we have recommended that with all the millions or billions having taken vaccine and generally fine. So if they choose not to, of course, we cannot force and hold them down and push the syringe into them. But if they choose not to take a vaccine, then their rights cannot be denied. but the application of the rights may demand a different kind of approach. So if you used to walk straight into an office now so they say, okay, now if you're not vaccinated, we've got another window there, or you can do it online. I think that for us is still a reasonable way, but no government agency, no one can say, sorry, we won't help you. This borang is not for you. Too bad. You can. That's a no. But that's how we sort of find the balance, Sharad, in terms of managing these two ends. But
So yeah, Gerald. So very quickly, Gerald. So in the case of, say, civil servants being mandated to be vaccinated, people in the armed forces, is that a violation of rights? I mean, is that a clear violation of rights?
Yeah. So some services are what we call essential services, and so people said that this service or this job scope needs you to be vaccinated because you come in contact or whatever the reason. So there is a choice for you not to still be in that service. I mean, your choice to be in a particular line of labor or labor services that you like, but that particular job needs you to be vaccinated, and then if you choose not to, there are other options available to you. But just saying that I cannot vote, I don't want to be vaccinated, and then too bad, that's also not fair, because in school example you have millions of kids, other adults there, and a few teachers don't want to vote. So how do you find that balance? You say, well, teacher, go ahead, but the kids and their parents say, well, I don't want to risk my kids because this guy or this woman is not vaccinated. So I think you always have a choice both ways, but I think the government has tried always. Some are moved to other areas of work, but some there's no other areas of work to move. So what do? You give them a choice and an option. But let's hope that over time people will be a bit more comfortable that vaccines are medicine. We were never experts on vaccination. We got all our shots before, but suddenly everybody is a doctor now.
That's
Analyze
right.
wrong, yeah.
Gerald, thank you so much for joining us today. Gerald Joseph from Semakam. We're gonna take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more on Malaysia's human rights report card, so to speak. Stay tuned to consider this. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Shrad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our look at Malaysia's human rights track record this year, as well as the gaps in our commitment to the human rights agenda. Firdaus Husni is a chief human rights strategist at the Malaysian Centre for Constitutionalism and Human Rights. Firdaus, I know, as we start our conversation, I know it's a little bit more nuanced than this, but I'm hoping that you can help us take stock of, say, the human rights track record of Malaysia, whether we've improved or not, and how you would rate Malaysia's report card on human rights, so to speak. Are we actually moving in the right direction on this front?
Well, we are moving forward in some aspect, but not in some. While there are also several areas in which we seem to be regressing. So overall, it has not been in the pace that we want to.
Okay, can you elaborate? What are some of those areas that we are regressing, as you pointed out?
Sure. So one quick example that I can think of would be the call for IPCMC, the Independent Police Complaints and Misconduct Commission. This has been going around for more than 10 years. Then it culminated into the tabling. I think we did have a first tabling in Parliament, and then it got withdrawn, and there was a discussion, there was a briefing, and there were also participation by the civil society. And this was, with the previous government. And then now with the current administration, we don't see that happening anytime soon. In fact, what we are hearing now is to have an IPCC, which is not the same with IPCMC, much watered down, and it's not reflecting the level of transparency and integrity that we would like to see in our police force. So that's one. And second would be in terms of engagement with civil society. And I think, as we all are aware, for more than half of 2021, it was colored with the emergency ordinance and the effect of the emergency ordinance. And most of the discussion centered around how under the emergency, powers are centered with only one agency of the government, and that is the executive. And for example, if you're talking about emergency ordinance number 2, and that's the fake news ordinance, that is essentially a threat to our freedom of expression. And we have seen throughout 2021, not just activists, young concerned citizens, whenever they are speaking out, either on the street or on social media, you've seen them being harassed, investigated, and taken for investigation by the authorities. These are not the kind of freedom of expression that we would like to see happening in Malaysia, but that is what we saw throughout this year.
Firdaus, there's another issue, of course, is that we've seen the courts provide some sort of relief, and we've seen tensions between decisions made by the court and the decision by the executive to fight those progressive outcomes. In your mind, especially as somebody who's kind of cheap, I really want to get into the question of strategy.
Sure.
Where should activists and ordinary Malaysians look to uphold their rights? Should they be looking to the court? Should they be petitioning government? Should they be going to the streets? How should we think about advancing human rights in Malaysia?
Thank you. Well, Sharat, I think that's an excellent question, and that is some of the things that we are pushing at MCCHR, and this is what you would call being strategic. And when we talk about strategic, I mentioned IPCMC earlier, and that's essentially pushing for change through legislation. But when we talk about going to courts, we talk about only 18 lawsuits, for example. We talk about the lawsuits by the Family Frontiers. We can also talk about that lawsuit by Amnesty International, as well as Asylum Access in trying to stop deportation of Myanmar national. All of that is also a form of activism through the use of courts, litigation. And another form would be demonstration. So we've seen that with the Black Flag movement. So these three has to go together. And so I would say, if we were talking about what are some of the positive things that we see happen in 2021, I would say the fact that the use of the courts, litigation, being utilized as a means of activism, as a means to force change, that to me is among the good news that we see. I mean, we see the courts granting the affected Malaysian mothers in the suit by Family Frontiers. We see the courts granting the interim order to in the suit by Amnesty International and Asylum Access. Yes, I think we all know the government went ahead and proceeded to deport them anyway. But the fact that the court recognized that there is an argument in which, as a member of the international committee, we should recognize the non-refoulement principle. You don't send back people who will be facing persecution in their country. So that's one. And of course, the Undi 18 lawsuit. And that's another win, not just for the civil society, but for the Malaysian citizen, the 18-year-old at large.
Right. Well, part of your role, as I understand it, is also to ensure that there is kind of a human rights awareness and education, like human rights literacy. And I'm just wondering about extending that conversation about upholding human rights beyond, say, the urban liberal progressive conversation. How do we ensure that this isn't just a very a conversation that's happening in a bubble, that it becomes more mass and more widespread?
All right. Well, that's a very relevant question, and I will say that even at a personal level, that I take that as a personal quest. I mean, we can talk all day about human rights, but how you want to bring it to something that everyday Malaysians can relate to. And I think it's first and foremost is that you always have to try to find common ground. There's always this contestation, for example, about things concerning the religion and the constitution, for example. But why don't we look at it from the angle and perspective of justice? Is that just? Let's not look at the label. So that's one. And second, many Malaysians don't realize, but that when you talk about human rights, it's essentially every aspect of your life. You may not use the rights language, but you are talking about that. I'll give an example. With the pandemic that we are very much in right now, it has actually opened conversation to the adequate standard of living. We are talking about right to work, housing, food, clean water, all of that. Those are all essentially economic, social and cultural rights. We may not use the rights language, but you see that being talked and being conversed more and more on social media, offline as well. And so to me, that is well, good news you could say that more and more Malaysians are aware, although they may not see it single-handedly as a human rights issue.
Fidas, we did have some wins for ordinary people. I mean, people, as it were, though I do believe people who live in are human beings too, but there are, beyond that, you know, the wins that the Orang Asli communities have had, at least in Selangor we had that, but also the fight, the very real fight that indigenous people and farmers in Sarawak, for instance, with invasion of their land, a lack of recognition for their land titles. We see that in Kelantan as well. Human rights does affect the ordinary person in very clear ways. How can those struggles be elevated so that we don't think of them necessarily as issues that only affect others, and and us, as it were, privileged, be indifferent to them?
Well, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to highlight here at MCCHR. Whenever we talk about, say, the issue of democracy, sometimes you hear people say, "Look, we're the majority, so too bad. Those in the minority and those were not provided the subsidies and the privileges. Too bad." To me, that's essentially what people are worried about. Democracy, and that shouldn't be what we are subscribing to. When we talk about a vibrant democracy here, it's not just about the rights of the majority, but the community which are outside that circle, outside that bubble, they too should be protected in terms of their rights. So it's really this realization and this awareness that we should be working towards. And so therefore, when we talk about say, the marginalized community, the Orang Asli community, for example, we should look at the fact that their rights too are protected in the Federal Constitution. And so this, to me, should be our point of reference. And the fact that some of us are more privileged than others, I think we should take that as a responsibility for us to speak up for those who have no voices, and for us to then shed light on those of us who are less privileged.
Well, you mentioned a bit earlier that there are several ways we can look to uphold our human rights through the legislative, through the judiciary, through civic participation. I'm wondering about the international dimension to this, because this year Malaysia won a seat in the UN Human Rights Council for the 2022 to 2024 term. And I'm just wondering, as we go into the new year and we're having a seat on this council, might we be pressured to be better behaved in our human rights track record, you reckon?
Oh, well, okay, so this is not the first time I've been asked this question. But my answer to this would be this. How would that affect Malaysia would be what we make of it, what we make of that seat that we got elected into. On the one hand, the last thing I want to see is Malaysia saying that, look, we've got elected and that's it. That means we're the best. When we talk about human rights and whatnot, all those criticism are invalid. No, no, no. If we are there on the Human Rights Council, but back at the home front, we are violating the human rights of the people, then clearly we are being hypocritical by actually gunning for that seat in the first place. And so to me, the fact that we are on Human Rights Council right now, that can be used as a good tool, and yes, as Melissa, as you pointed out, it can be used as an effective tool for a civil society to then pressure the government, look, you're on Human Rights Council, and this is the time that you should walk the talk and not just be there and do nothing. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Firdaus Husni from the Malaysian Centre for Constitutionalism and Human Rights. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. Don't forget to get the latest information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com, as well as the Astro Awani app. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.
Good night.